What's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. I'm Ben, and for the last 8 years now, I've been cutting my dual sport teeth on giant 460-pound monsters like the Gen 2 KLR 650, which sadly was totaled in a wreck on my way to pick up the XR 700. I rode that bike for a bit and then sold it to my dad after doing some comparison videos with the newly updated Gen 3 KLR 650. As I rode these bikes more and more, my off-road skills improved. And as my off-road skills improved, I wanted to push these bikes further and further off the road on trails that, well, they simply just did not belong on. So when it came time to look for my next motorcycle, I realized that if I was going to continue to do silly things like I had with the Gen 2, the Gen 3, and the XR, that I really needed to buy something a little bit more purpose-built, which is why I headed straight for the opposite end of the big bore dual sport spectrum and picked up this 40 horsepower, 350-pound Honda XR650L. Of course, in stock form, this bike is a far cry from the comfort of the Gen 2 and Gen 3 KLR, but with the Hemisphere off-road rally dash and a giant CarPlay nav unit, I was feeling a little bit more at home. So we took the bike up to my dual sport proving ground, Harrison Hills, to see just what that 13.25 inches of ground clearance and 12 inches of suspension travel would feel like on trails that I had previously ripped the Gen 2, Gen 3, and XR 700 on. And I've got to say, I was nothing but impressed by this bike. It ate up absolutely everything that I threw at it, and it felt so much more purpose-built for this type of riding. The only real complaint that I had was that around the corners and in slower moving trails, the bike would start to feel a little bit more top-heavy than I would like. And I sort of just assumed it was something that I would have to get used to. But then I traded my Gen 3 KLR 650 for this much lower DR650, and I'm less interested in the seat height of this bike and more interested in the fact that because it has a much lower center of gravity, it actually handles much better for 95% of the riding that I'll do. So in the name of moto journalism and to satisfy my own curiosity, I loosened up all 8 triple tree fasteners as well as the fork boots and slid the triple tree clamps down to the lowest setting, which is, yes, of course, intended by Honda. That dropped the signal bracket from 44 inches to about 43.25, dropping about 3/4 of an inch in the front. And to lower the back, I went with the Hemisphere off-road lowering link. This can be adjusted on the bike anywhere from 1 inch a drop to 2. I left it at just a 1-inch drop for now. And when we took a few measurements, it looked like we went from about 41.75 on the top of the taillight to 40 inches, which is a 1 3/4 inch drop. At the center portion of the seat, it looked like we went from 36.25 down to 35.25, meaning about a 1-inch drop. And even though the DR seat is still technically lower, I was pretty surprised by the results when I threw a leg over both of them. The XR seat is definitely not as sort of rounded, but boy, that feels a lot like a DR650, maybe even a little bit closer to the ground. And since we started off with 13.25 inches of ground clearance, we're still left with over a foot, which is still a comical amount of ground clearance, much more than anything else that I'd ridden. And I've got to say, even though we only did drop it about an inch, this bike felt so much better out on the road. It was a lot more fun in the corners. The only downside was that it didn't quite wheelie as well, but I've got to say, the amount of playfulness and fun that this provided on the gravel, allowing me to sort of lean the bike around and mess around a bit more than I ever had before, I've got to say it definitely felt like it was worth it. But of course, we needed to do some intense off-road riding, so we headed up to my dual sport proving ground again, this time with my buddy Jason on his DR650. We ran down the exact same trails as I did with my dad when the bike was at its original height. And for those of you who are just as against lowering a dual sport motorcycle as I used to be, I would say you owe it to yourself to keep an open mind during this video. Realize that I'm not being paid to promote this product. I don't even make any money off of the links down in the description. I really just wanted to try this to see if it would improve the bike for my dual sport adventure purposes, and also to put the information out there for anyone who was turned away by the 37-inch seat height, because I think this is definitely a motorcycle worth considering. So hang on tight and let's see how the newly lowered XR handles some of my favorite trails.
Yeah, I want to say even like standing up on this thing, trying to lean it over to one side to the next, it seems like with that center of gravity a little bit lower, it doesn't take as much effort, and it doesn't seem like it gets, whoa, there's some sand. It doesn't get like as out of hand, where before it was like driving a building through these trails, you know. It's like you get just a little bit leaned over and all of a sudden you can feel the weight, where just, I'm surprised that just an inch made that much of a difference, but I suppose inch isn't nothing.
But as good as the XR was feeling, I wasn't sure that it felt quite as stable as my DR at home, so Jason and I swapped bikes quick for a test ride.
Ooh, that does feel different. Certainly more.
The seats were really wide.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and it's a little, this is definitely squishier. I feel like it even feels different than my DR. How could that be?
Lower pegs, maybe, or?
Yeah, I guess maybe that has something to do with it. How does that feel for like top heaviness? You notice that it's any worse?
No. I just noticed that my feet feel really high.
In stock form, when you'd ride, I mean, like my dad jumped from the DR to the XR, and he's like, I do not like this. As far as the, like, kind of the top heaviness of it goes, and just how stable it feels, whoa. This thing might still feel a little bit more nimble. I don't know. Either way, I mean, it's a pretty noticeable difference on the XR having it lowered.
Yeah, I can tell this suspension's a little stiffer. Like, you hit those bumps and there's not much like travel. It's not a bad thing either, though. You know, it stays planted.
Right. It eats it okay. Where this, it definitely soaks them up, but then there's almost a little bit too much soaking action going on that sort of throws you off a bit.
Yeah, like here, like every rock and crevice, like you feel it, you know.
Yeah, you certainly do. It definitely tells you what's going on.
It doesn't even look that low, like for lowering it. It looks.
No, it really doesn't look too much different, does it?
It almost looks still higher than mine.
Yeah, I suppose it does. Here, I'll park it next to it. I think the back goes up more. I don't know. And mine leans over so far, I guess it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, I was just looking between like the tire and the fender, though.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, sure.
And the and the frame, the ground clearance.
Yeah, I think I definitely still have more ground clearance.
Yeah.
Just because the motor's a little bit higher. But I think that's why the DR always feels a little bit more glued to the road, just because the heaviest part is so much lower. So what do you think? Are you happy on your DR, or would you rather have an XR?
It's definitely fun. I mean, they're a little different, but nothing you can't tune out.
Right.
This one, like, I'm not sure how bad it is yet, but it's definitely like bouncy. Like right now, I feel it like you hit like 2 more bounces after a bump, you know?
Yep.
Which I think riding more aggressively will lead to wheel spin.
Oh my gosh, we found the washboard now. Yikes. How's the DR do on that? Oh, it's sandy too. Oh.
Definitely feeling it. Yeah, I'm sure you're getting like bone jarring, you know.
I suppose, yeah.
I don't feel that, at least.
Yeah, this bike is just definitely so much easier to ride now, being lowered like that. It really, I can tell just sitting down and now being a little bit lazier, or, you know, not pushing it so hard. I can tell it's just a much friendlier bike to ride. It doesn't feel like it's trying to get me to go over and take a nap.
Dirt nap.
Yeah. Who would have thought? Lowering a dirt bike would help. I think I'm definitely a lot less worn out than I would be if I was on the Tenere or the KLR, especially riding how we were earlier. Oh yeah, more sand. Lots of sand. That's why this is kind of I call it my dual sport test track, or dual sport proving ground, because if you can make it through all the terrain here, you can pretty much ride anywhere. Plenty of different types of soil and sand and rocks, and oh, there's a lot of rocks on the backside of that jump. Yeah, now that I'm a bit wore out, I can tell when I hit the rocks and it kind of tosses the bike to the side. I think this definitely is not as easy to ride. Not easy, but it's not. I can tell that the center of gravity is still much higher than the DR. I think that one, just with a motor just being a couple inches closer to the ground, is always just going to feel a bit more steady.
Now, I know even after all that, some of you guys are still going to tell me that I did nothing but absolutely wreck the legendary Baja performance that Honda built into the XR. And you know what? you're right. I did reduce the ground clearance. I did reduce the suspension travel in the rear. And I believe by increasing that link length, there is a bit more mechanical advantage on both the shock and spring. And I believe that's why when I go to try to wheelie the bike now, it seems like there's a little bit more squish in the back and not so much wheeling potential. It still jumps just fine. I mean, maybe that tire is disappearing a little bit more into the wheel well on the jumps than it did previously. But to be honest, it's not anything that threw me off or that I noticed. I never actually bottomed it. If I really wanted to add a little bit more preload in the back, I think a lot of that would probably go away. Sure, it's not going to be back to the legendary Baja performance, but to be honest, this bike always had way more off-road capability than I ever needed, at least as far as running on a motocross track, but that's obviously not what I'm building this bike into. I want this bike to be a little bit more road oriented, and I want it to be, well, as good on and off road as I feel like my DR650 is, without the, well, wallowy soft suspension. And if you're somebody that is sort of comparing the KLR, the DR, and the XR, I think the DR probably makes the most sense out of the box if you're somebody that doesn't need all that ground clearance and doesn't want to throw your leg over a 37-inch seat height. But it seems like if you are able to stick a couple $100 into lowering this bike, the XR maybe is a better option than the DR because you don't have to stick thousands into the suspension, even absolutely as is, without increasing the preload on the back. I really think the XR felt like it handled what we were riding on a lot better than the DR did. And I'm not trying to down talk the DR at all. Of course, if you upgrade the suspension, I think that's probably a bike that makes a bit more sense as an adventure dual sport just because of the cush drive in the rear, because of the oil cooler. It's just a bike I think that is a little bit more middle of the road. Like I said, the KLR is kind of on one side, the XR is on the absolute opposite. And I think really what lowering this did is just sort of brought it back kind of in line a bit more with the KLR and with the DR. But honestly, I think for off-road riding is still a much, much better motorcycle. If you're somebody that is only going to run this bike on motocross tracks, then obviously that's not something that you're going to be interested in. You want that ground clearance. You want that extra performance. But if you're just somebody that's trying to build an adventure dual sport like I am, everything is better. It's so much easier to get on the bike. It's so much easier to get off the bike. It's going to be so much better when it's loaded down with luggage. Obviously, if I'm going to put camping gear on the back of this thing, that's only going to raise the center of gravity. So for what I'm building it for, I mean, I think it's so much better. I like it so much better on the pavement. I like it so much better off-road. And that's why I've decided the next time I take this thing out, I am going to ride it a bit as is, and then probably on the trail, drop that link to the full 2 inches of drop. I'm hoping that it will maybe clear some of the speculations that I've been making during this video up a bit. Maybe it will bring some things out that I never noticed. Maybe I'll like it a lot better, maybe because the seat will be a little bit closer to flat. It might be even a bit more comfy for me both on and off the road. I do worry a little bit that when I do go to pile that camping gear on there, that with that extra little bit of link length, the mechanical advantage will be working against the suspension a little bit too much and I'll run into bottoming situations. But to be honest, I was trying to build this bike into something that was better for me and my type of riding than my KLRs, and I bought my KLRs all the time without any luggage. So I think with that in mind, I've done nothing for my intents and purposes but improve this motorcycle. Anytime you make a modification to a dual sport like this for either on or off-road performance, you run the risk of degrading it in one category or the other. And the most important thing is finding that sweet spot for you. So hopefully I've helped some of you guys out that were considering this bike, but were a little bit hesitant because of all the naysayers as far as lowering the bike. I think this is definitely worth investigating. And if the XR is always a bike that you've been interested in, but were sort of afraid of the seat height and afraid to lower it, I would say this, so far anyways, definitely has my seal of approval. Again, we will be taking this thing out again to try dropping it even a little bit further. So if you guys want to make sure you see that video, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you guys watching along each week. Thanks for watching today. Take care, stay safe, stay swanky, get out and enjoy this beautiful world God created any chance you get.